So what's the art and science of decision making? My comments are primarily aimed at providing practical guidance. You all can read what the law says. Sometimes you can even make sense of it. Sometimes Bernie and I can even make sense of it. But it's really aimed at providing practical guidance to A, try and keep you out of trouble and make your job a little easier. One way to enhance what I'm going to talk about tonight is for this not to end tonight. Discuss it with your board, your other land use boards in town, the selectmen, your planner if you have one, neighboring planning boards and officials. Learn from them and teach them. Talk to each other. When I've been on planning boards in towns, I've tried to arrange at least annually, if not more often, a meeting between the planning board and the zoning board. I think that's an essential component of trying to do things correctly. You ought to know as a planning board member, other than having to look at notices, what is happening at the zoning board. Are you getting variances, applications on a lot of them on the same sections of the ordinance? If you are, maybe that means it's time for the ordinance to be revised, or at least consider revising it. So these meetings and communication are really a good tool. So we all know Albert E. Newman. But why should a board be concerned with its decision? Simply, can it be enforced? Is it lawful? And is it reasonable? Why those terms, lawful and reasonable? Because those are the grounds on which a court can invalidate your decision. It's contrary to law or it's unreasonable. Years ago, the standard included unjust, and the court came down with a decision saying, we've ignored that for too long, so the legislature turned around and said, okay, we're going to eliminate that. So now we just have the two grounds. But there's also the other issues that I talked about, which is preemption, which really is contrary to law, but sometimes it's a little harder to figure out. And if it is lawful and reasonable, the next question that should be asked is, how do administrators, enforcement personnel, know about what you've decided and what is required? Most land use board decisions today require something to be done. Conditions. Some affect property values. If you get a subdivision approval, 674-37A says it affects property values under certain conditions. How does your assessor know about that? Does the assessor automatically get notified, or does he have to go to look at it? How about the building inspector or code enforcement officer? What about selectmen? Are they notified of decisions, conditions? So I want to move on to what are the legal limits on what you can do with decisions. Not all the limits, but these are two called takings and exactions. A taking basically is when a regulation goes too far, interfering with property rights. That's what the U.S. Supreme Court said way back in Pennsylvania Cole versus Mahan. Okay? That was simply what the court said 90 years ago. And then it basically left it, except for one other case. It didn't do anything more on takings law and land use control until the 70s. And then it came back with a vengeance, trying to define what it meant when a regulation goes too far. At times, the standard changed, and then the court went back. And basically what a land use taking is under the Constitution, federal law, is that it does not have a valid public purpose as applied under that standard, and it denies a person all economically viable or all reasonable economically viable use of their property without a good reason. Okay, what are good reasons? Well, our court in a couple of cases has said wetlands protection is a real good cause. And in Simpson versus State a long time ago, it said, hey, we haven't denied you all reasonable use of your property if it involves tidal wetlands, because you can go out and look at it. Isn't that wonderful? But you can't build on it. Okay. A variation on this is this exactions law. So an exaction is simply a requirement imposed by a land use board that you do something or not do something as a condition of getting a land use permit. Can involve physically doing something, physically paying for doing something, not doing something, leaving a portion of your property in open space, that's not doing something, not developing. It can involve donating land, what is called dedications to the public, and it can involve one or more of the above or anything. So it's a pretty broad term. One word of caution, it's in the materials, is if you're talking about dedications, that is, you're requiring that the developer provide some degree of property to the town for park, for open space, for traffic. There's a lot of cases in New Hampshire. One of them is right here in Laconia, Robbins Auto Parts. They wanted Robbins Auto Parts, when it enlarged its store a little bit, to donate money for the widening of Union Avenue. And that was the only property that they were going to require that for. And the court said, why? If you only have that short frontage of 200 feet, how in the world are you going to widen Union Avenue? Doesn't work. The more egregious case was JED Associates versus the town of Atkinson. Atkinson had a regulation that said whenever you subdivide property, you donate to the town 7.5% of your land. Or, since we recognize that this might result in scattered land all over the town, and it would be coordinated, instead of giving us land, you can just give us money equal to 7.5% of your land, without any consideration of the benefits, burdens, or other things that we now require. Our Supreme Court had little use for that, calling it an outright plan of extortion. Okay. So don't do that. What we have decided to do in New Hampshire and elsewhere, because this notion of dedicating open space or land results in, the land doesn't get developed sequentially. It gets developed when somebody's ready to develop. And that doesn't necessarily fit in with our plans for parkland and recreation space or schools or whatever. And so we came up with the concept of money in lieu of those improvements. And then we started saying, well, doing that on a case-by-case basis isn't necessarily the best way to do it, because we got to do all this stuff that makes us go on to hire planners and engineers and accountants and everybody else. So what we came up with was the notion of impact fees. And I'm going to talk about an impact fee at the end of the case, at the end of the hour, that suggests that impact fees are good. Impact fees do certain things very well, but impact fees can cause a lot of problems. And we'll talk about that if they're not done right. Exactions in and of themselves, that is a requirement that a developer do something or not do something as a condition of getting a permit, are not per se invalid or valid. They are looked at closely though. Over the course of time, there have been 3 primary tests that have been used to judge whether or not they're valid. Now there's only one because of the Supreme Court decision. We had only one in New Hampshire since 1977. The US Supreme Court finally caught up with our forward thinking. The other tests were called the but-for test, which was, but for the development, with the town or city wouldn't be doing anything, so the developer, you have to pay the full freight, pay for everything. The other most stringent test was it had to, whatever you imposed on the developer had to be directly attributable to the development, so that you couldn't do something just because it was in the public interest. It had to be address a concern raised directly. What we now have is the middle ground, which is called the rational nexus test. Okay, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But what they are designed, what an exaction properly used is designed to do is offset impacts on development that are caused by development. They shift at least some of the costs that are of public need that are attributable to development. Good examples, okay? We need road improvements because you're going to add more traffic, okay? That's been part of the toolkit in local government for years. And then the Supreme Court looked at it and said, well, maybe not. The legislature came to the rescue and said, yes, okay, that's something that is properly done as an exaction as part of development approvals. But this is not designed to raise revenue. It's not tax money. It's designed for specific purposes. That's what an exaction is. It's not designed to line the public treasury. So the key factors, even before the US Supreme Court cases I'm going to talk about, were, is it related to the development somehow? And how much is too much? Okay, those were sort of vague terms, sort of like the taking goes too far in the Pennsylvania coal case. Now we have a federal baseline case. Deserves a little discussion. This is Nolan versus the California Coastal Commission. This was 10 years after our case that used the same terminology, rational nexus. Rational nexus is, you can put on whatever meaning you want to it. What it really means is that whatever you're requiring the person to do, the developer to do, has to be related to something that the developer is doing in a public interest. Nolan had a small little cottage. It wasn't really small. Nothing in California is really small. But it was an old house and he wanted to replace it, and it was on the coastline. And California had this coastal commission law that could say, well, in order to do that, you have to do this. Now, if you'll think of Nolan's house, it was this wide and this tall. That is the backside of Nolan's property, looking out over the Pacific Ocean. The area where the water is called the intertidal zone, which is the area between high tide and low tide. Under the California Constitution, the state owned that. The public owned it. Okay, and you could walk on that because it was owned by, even though Nolan owned on the shore side of the tidal zone, you couldn't walk on that without his permission. Okay, so California Coastal Commission, when they looked at Nolan's proposal to replace his house, said, oh, well, if you do that, you got to provide access across your property to get to the beach. And Nolan said, I don't really want people walking across my property to get to the beach. There's a public beach down the road and they can walk in the intertidal zone and do all that stuff. There's another beach up the road a piece. But they said, no, you either do it or you don't get permission to tear down your house and build your new one. No. So Mr. Nolan decided he wanted to challenge that. Now the interesting thing about the case and why it's important for what you can do legally for exactions. You see that? That's a seawall. And it protects the shoreline so that Mr. Nolan's property and the other properties don't fall into the ocean. How tall do you think that is? It's hard to tell from the picture. 8 to 10 feet, okay? Now, the reasoning of the California Coastal Commission for requiring this access and limiting the width of his house, that was another factor, was so that the public could be aware that they had the right to walk in the intertidal zone and could see it from the street. Now, you don't have to be an expert in geography or geometry to know that somebody driving in a car out here is going to have a real difficult time to see somebody walking along here. Maybe they could see Kareem Abdul-Jabbar if he was walking on stilts, but any other person they're not going to see. No rational relationship between the exaction and the impact created by the development. Then we come to Dolan. Dolan versus the city of Tigard. It's in Oregon. Dolan owned a plumbing supply shop, small, and he wanted to expand it a little bit. And the city of Tigard said, oh, that's great. While you're at it, we'd like you to do two things. Give us a part of your property where we can install a bicycle path and where we can have part of it set aside for green space. And he said, what? I'm just expanding my plumbing business, you know? And the city said, well, what about all the traffic you're going to generate? And we need a bicycle path. And my immediate reaction when I heard this was, how many people go shopping for plumbing supplies on a bicycle? Okay. Parking, maybe some traffic improvements, but a bicycle lane? To take traffic, bicycle traffic to accommodate expansion of a plumbing shop? Okay. So there was this relationship question, but it was more a question, I mean, he was willing to do something, but the green space, this stuff and some other stuff. And the court looked at it, this is the US Supreme Court, and they said, wait a minute, that's out of whack. You really, really need to think about what you're requiring this guy to do in relationship to what he's doing to the property. So now we have what added to the equation here, rough proportionality. You don't have to have a mathematically exact relationship between what you impose on somebody when they want to develop property and the cost and benefit analysis. What these two doctrines, rational relationship and rough proportionality, do is say in two cases what the New Hampshire Supreme Court said in Landvest versus Plainfield in 1977. And our rational nexus test says there has to be some sort of reasonable balance between the benefits and burdens. Benefits and burdens on the developer. He gets a benefit by being able to develop the property, but burdens are imposed on him by having to comply with the exaction requirement. Benefits and burdens to the municipality, weighing the burdens that are created on public facilities by the development and the benefits to them of the exaction that's imposed. It's mushy, but it's a thinking process you have to go through.
Crop TV.